Hi, I'm June, and today I'll be discussing gerrymandering, explaining its significance, exploring several policies that could be passed to address it, as well as the implications of those policies on the problem and the levels of government involved, analyzing the role of the citizen in the creation, passage, and execution of these solutions, and the connections and interactions between gerrymandering, policy actions, and civil actions by considering several points of historical and political evidence. I'll specifically do this by explaining gerrymandering, its significance and policy implications, discussing case studies of policy actions and their consequences with evidence, exploring interactions between gerrymandering, civic actions, and policymaking, and finally reflecting on the importance of policy and characteristics of an effective citizen. Part 1, the problem. So gerrymandering is the manipulation of electoral district boundaries to favor a particular political party or group, often by strategically packing voters of the opposing party into a single district or cracking them across multiple districts to dilute their voting power. This practice undermines fair representation by distorting the democratic principle of one person, one vote, enabling those in power to secure electoral advantages regardless of actual voter preferences. Gerrymandering can be used to protect incumbents, influence election outcomes, and increase partisan dominance, and is often challenged in court on constitutional grounds, particularly concerning voting rights and the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment. The census determines the population distribution across the country, and its data can be used to redraw congressional district boundaries, which can then be manipulated through gerrymandering to favor certain political parties or groups. There are two primary mechanisms of gerrymandering: packing and cracking. Packing occurs when the opposing party's voters are concentrated into a single district, which minimizes their influence in other districts and ensures a strong win for the manipulating party in multiple neighboring districts. Cracking, on the other hand, involves spreading the opposing party's voters across several districts to prevent them from achieving a majority in any of them, which weakens their voting power. A third, less common type is kidnapping, where district boundaries are redrawn to force incumbents into new districts, often by pitting them against each other. So gerrymandering can be categorized into several distinct types. The common denominator among all of them is the goal of manipulating electoral outcomes for political gain. Partisan gerrymandering occurs when district boundaries are intentionally drawn by the ruling party to maximize their chances of winning elections, often through techniques like cracking, where opposition voters, as we discussed, are dispersed across many districts to dilute their influence, or packing, where opposition voters are concentrated into one district to reduce their overall impact. Racial gerrymandering involves drawing district lines to either concentrate racial minority voters into a single district, which diminishes their influence in other areas, or to scatter them across multiple districts to prevent them from forming a majority in any, which violates the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, bipartisan gerrymandering happens when both major parties collaborate to draw distinct boundaries that protect incumbents and minimize electoral competition, which often results in safe districts where elections are not competitive. Incumbent gerrymandering is a subset of bipartisan gerrymandering where district boundaries are manipulated specifically to protect current office holders, which ensures that they remain in power regardless of actual voter preferences. These forms of gerrymandering subvert the democratic principle of fair representation by prioritizing political advantage over the will of the voters. The Supreme Court has ruled that equal protection challenges to race-based gerrymandering and one person, one vote claims based on unequal districts are justiciable. However, it has ruled that partisan gerrymandering claims, which involves the manipulation of district boundaries for political advantage, are not justiciable, leaving the issue to be addressed by state courts or through legislative action rather than federal judicial intervention. Now, gerrymandering creates safe districts by drawing boundaries that favor one political party, which makes it nearly impossible for the opposing party to win, regardless of the voters' preferences. This results in a lack of competition and discourages moderate candidates, which contributes to ideological polarization, as representatives are more likely to cater to their party's extremes rather than appealing to a broader, more diverse electorate. In addition, gerrymandering can create majority-minority districts, where the aim is often to concentrate minority voters into a single district to reduce their influence in others, which dilutes their political power and can decrease voter turnout, as people in districts that are heavily gerrymandered may feel that their votes do not matter, which decreases political efficacy, or the belief that one's vote can make a difference, and leads to lower rates of political participation. When voters perceive their district as predetermined for one party, they are less likely to participate in congressional elections, which weakens its legitimacy. When legislators are allowed to draw their own districts, as is common in states where the state legislature controls redistricting, they often create boundaries that make their own seats more secure, which usually leads to less competitive districts and can contribute to greater polarization. This is because as districts become more strongly aligned with one party, representatives have less incentive to appeal to voters from the opposing party, which causes them to adopt more extreme positions instead of centrist views. The creation of majority-minority districts is also an important factor in the redistricting process because it ensures that large voting blocks are not split across multiple districts to weaken their political influence. Both Democrats and Republicans have argued that eliminating partisan gerrymandering could threaten these districts. Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act sometimes mandates that states create majority-minority districts to protect the voting power of minority groups. Some argue that these districts often require partisan gerrymandering, and without it, majority-minority districts would disappear. However, Brennan's report refutes this, finding no connection between partisan bias and majority-minority districts in redistricting maps from the 1990s to the 2010s. The report also suggests that banning partisan gerrymandering could prevent minority communities from being exploited to gain partisan advantage by either party. On the other hand, there is concern that black voters are being packed into majority-minority districts, which can reduce their overall influence by concentrating their majority power in select areas. In Alabama, for example, Democrats argue that black voters have been packed into the 7th district. While majority-minority districts are important for representation, they can be manipulated depending on which party holds power. Now, one significant policy implication of gerrymandering is its impact on the legislative branch, particularly its ability to shape the composition of Congress and state legislators in ways that distort representative democracy. By creating safe districts for a particular party, gerrymandering increases partisan control by allowing one party to dominate regardless of changes in public opinion, which affects legislative outcomes by incentivizing lawmakers to cater to extremes of their party rather than to moderate or bipartisan constituencies, as we discussed. Consequently, legislative bodies become more polarized, which makes it harder to pass bipartisan policies. Gerrymandering also undermines the system of checks and balances by skewing the electoral process in favor of one party, which reduces the legitimacy of the legislative branch as a representative body. Additionally, gerrymandering influences congressional representation by manipulating district boundaries to affect congressional reapportionment and the election of representatives. Following the census, seats in the House of Representatives are apportioned among the states based on population changes, and state legislatures or commissions redraw district boundaries. When gerrymandering occurs during this redistricting process, it skews the political composition of a state's congressional delegation. For instance, partisan gerrymandering can ensure one party wins a disproportionate number of seats relative to its statewide vote share, which effectively locks in control of that state's delegation in Congress. This distortion weakens the principle of proportional representation, resulting in a Congress that may not reflect the national electorate's preferences, which in turn also impacts national legislative policy making on issues such as healthcare, education, protection of abortion rights, gun ownership, and economic reform. At the state level, gerrymandering influences the composition of both the House and the Senate by consolidating political power within a party. Just the House. By consolidating political power within a party, which enables it to pass legislation with minimal opposition, even if it lacks majority statewide support. So in this way, gerrymandering is important because it directly impacts citizens' representation, the balance of power among government branches, and the integrity of constitutional principles. For citizens, gerrymandering determines whether their votes carry equal weight or are diluted, which affects political efficacy and turnout, as we discussed. At the state and federal levels, gerrymandering influences legislative outcomes by shaping which policies are enacted, how government power is distributed between political parties, and the ability of state senators and federal representatives to enact legislation that responds to public needs. It also undermines constitutional principles like those established in the Equal Protection Clause and the one person, one vote doctrine, which raises questions about fairness and democratic legitimacy and makes addressing gerrymandering important in preserving a functional representative democracy. For example, in 2011, Republican strategist Thomas Hofeller was hired to redraw North Carolina's political districts, and he used racial gerrymandering to increase Republican power in both federal and state legislatures. One of his most infamous creations was Congressional District 12, a bizarrely shaped district that connected black communities in Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Charlotte. By packing these predominantly black voters into a single district, Hofeller effectively diluted their influence in surrounding districts, which ensured Republican dominance in the U.S. House of Representatives. This strategy was also applied to state legislative districts, where black communities in cities like Winston-Salem and Greensboro were similarly concentrated into single districts, which limited their ability to win a Democratic majority in elections across multiple districts. The result was a disproportionate number of Republican victories, even in areas with significant black populations, which increased the party's control over the state legislature. The maps, however, faced legal challenges under the Voting Rights Act and the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In 2016 and 2017, federal courts ruled that North Carolina's maps constituted unconstitutional racial gerrymandering. The court found that the deliberate packing of black voters into specific districts diluted their voting power, which again violated their rights under the Equal Protection Clause and the Voting Rights Act's prohibition of racially discriminatory redistricting processes. The courts ordered the state to redraw its district lines without using racial demographics as a factor, but Hofeller, tasked with redistricting, pivoted to partisan gerrymandering. Instead of focusing on race, Hofeller used voting data to identify Democratic strongholds and systematically diluted their influence. In Greensboro, for example, he cracked a concentrated Democratic area into two districts, which ensured Democrats were the minority in both. This approach was replicated statewide, resulting in maps that heavily favored Republicans. In the 2018 congressional midterm election, despite Democrats securing 51% of the votes for state representatives, they only won 46% of the seats. Democrats won half of state Senate votes, but won only 42% of the seats. Similarly, they secured nearly half of the congressional votes, but won only 3 out of 13 seats in the U.S. House. The Supreme Court addressed partisan gerrymandering in 2019, but ruled it was beyond the judiciary's authority to resolve, which effectively left such matters to state courts. Later that year, North Carolina Supreme Court declared that partisan gerrymandering was unconstitutional under the state constitution. Part 2. Policy Solutions. So I've drafted 3 possible policy actions that could be passed to address gerrymandering. Independent redistricting commissions are nonpartisan or bipartisan bodies established to draw electoral district boundaries, typically consisting of equal representation from Democrats, Republicans, and independents/third parties, with strict criteria such as population equality, compliance with the Voting Rights Act, and geographic compactness to eliminate partisan bias or racial bias. Internal boundary guidelines refer to legal standards that govern the redistricting process, such as prohibitions on splitting communities of interest, mandates for geographical contiguity, or requirements to avoid partisan favoritism. Alternative methods of representation, such as proportional representation or ranked choice voting, restructure electoral systems to allocate legislative seats based on vote shares and voter preferences, respectively, which reduces the impact of gerrymandering by breaking the direct link between district boundaries and election outcomes. Now, one potential solution to gerrymandering is the establishment of independent redistricting commissions, which are designed to take the power of drawing district lines away from partisan state legislators. Specifically, a policy requiring states to use independent redistricting commissions to draw congressional district lines, except in states with only one congressional district, and prohibiting partisan gerrymandering would establish a fair framework to prevent politically motivated manipulation of electoral maps. By federally mandating equal representation of Democrats, Republicans, and independents on these commissions, and requiring proposed maps to gain a majority vote with at least one affirmative vote from each political affiliation, the policy would promote bipartisan collaboration and encourage maps that prioritize population equality, compactness, and the preservation of communities of interest over partisan advantage by prohibiting maps that favor or disfavor a political party to create less polarized and more competitive districts. An independent redistricting commission policy would be passed and enacted through a structured process involving multiple levels of government. At the federal level, the policy would likely begin as a bill introduced in Congress by a representative or senator. It would be referred to relevant committees such as the House Judiciary or Senate Rules and Administration Committee, where legislators would hear testimony from experts, advocates, and affected communities. The bill would undergo markup sessions for revisions before being reported to the full chamber for a debate and vote. If approved in both chambers, it would be sent to the President for signing into law. Once enacted, the Department of Justice would oversee compliance with federal requirements, such as Voting Rights Act protections, to ensure states meet standards for fairness and minority representation. At the state level, legislators would be required to implement the federal mandate or adopt a similar policy independently. This could involve creating state-specific enabling legislation to define the composition and operational rules for independent commissions. State election boards would also be tasked with recruiting and vetting commission members according to specified criteria, such as balanced political affiliation and absence of partisan ties. Commissions would then conduct public hearings and draft maps based on data provided by the U.S. Census Bureau, in compliance with federal and state criteria. Courts of both federal and state levels would serve as arbiters to resolve disputes and to ensure compliance with constitutional principles and statutory mandates. Additionally, states with direct democracy provisions might pass such policies through ballot initiatives, which would bypass the legislature entirely. Now, the Independent Redistricting Commission policy would be arrived at through a multi-step process involving both legislative action and citizen participation. So initially, citizens would play an important role by advocating for the policies through petitions, public forums, and by organizing or joining interest groups that support nonpartisan redistricting, such as Common Cause or the League of Women Voters. These organizations would lobby state legislators or even push for a statewide ballot initiative to create an independent commission. Once introduced into the legislature, the bill would be debated among lawmakers hearing from citizens, citizens advocacy groups, and experts who provide testimony on the merits of fair districting practices. Citizens could also participate in hearings or town halls organized by the legislature or commissions, where they would voice their concerns and propose amendments. If passed, the policy would be executed by the relevant state or federal agencies, such as the State Election Board, which would be responsible for selecting the commission members. Citizens might also monitor and challenge the commission's work through the courts to ensure that the redistricting process is carried out in line with legal and constitutional standards. Another policy action to address gerrymandering is the adoption of a policy requiring independent redistricting commissions to draw congressional lines based on a six-part nonpartisan criteria, which would help protect against partisan manipulation and uphold the constitutionality of internal boundaries. First, it would mandate population equality to adhere to the principle of one person, one vote by creating districts of nearly equal population. Second, compliance with the Voting Rights Act would protect against racial discrimination by protecting the ability of minority groups to elect candidates of their choice. Third, racial requirements such as prohibiting retrogression, which is the reducing of electoral influence of minority groups, would influence dilution of their voting power, including where minorities vote in coalition with others. Fourth, respecting political subdivisions and communities of interest helps maintain the integrity of cities, counties, and groups with shared cultural, social, or economic interests and would help prevent unnecessary fragmentation. Fifth, banning maps that unduly advantage any political party ensures elections are competitive and representative. Lastly, geographical compactness and contiguity prevents the creation of bizarrely shaped districts that undermine voter trust and accessibility by promoting clear and reasonable boundaries for representation. To pass and enact the Internal Boundary Guidelines policy, whether or not it includes the Independent Redistricting Commission policy, the process would unfold across multiple levels of government, with some differences depending on the inclusion of independent commissions. So first, at the federal level, Congress would introduce the policy in the form of a bill, likely through the House Judiciary Committee or the Senate Rules Committee, which specialize in election law and constitutional issues. In the case where independent redistricting committees are not included, the bill would focus strictly on internal boundary criteria, as we discussed earlier, such as population equality, compliance with the Voting Rights Act, racial requirements, and respect for political subdivisions. Legislators would hold hearings to solicit expert opinions, testimonies from advocacy groups as well, and feedback from state officials. After debate and markup sessions, the bill would proceed to votes in both the House and the Senate. If approved, the bill would be sent to the President for signing into law. In this scenario, the U.S. Census Bureau and the DOJ would provide oversight to ensure that the districts comply with population equality and Voting Rights Act protections. In contrast, if the policy included independent redistricting commissions, state legislators would be required to establish these commissions and provide resources for their operation. The federal law would set a framework for the establishment and operation of these commissions, but it would be up to state governments to implement the commissions according to the established guidelines. States without such commissions would need to pass enabling legislation, and those that already have them would need to amend them to incorporate the specific 6 criteria. State legislators would either adopt or amend these laws to ensure compliance with federal guidelines. For states with independent commissions, lawmakers would have to adjust commission's rules to reflect the 6 boundary criteria, and potentially requiring changes to how commissioners are selected and how maps are proposed. States without independent redistricting commissions would need to create them by passing new laws or amendments to establish these commissions and ensure that they follow the policy directives. State courts would also play an important role in overseeing the compliance of redistricting maps with both the new federal law and state constitutions. If any district lines violate the internal boundary guidelines, state courts would have the authority to strike down maps and require redrawing. In cases of alleged federal constitutional violations, such as the Voting Rights Act noncompliance or racial gerrymandering, cases could be appealed to federal courts as well. Now, the internal boundary guidelines policy would be arrived at through a combination of public advocacy, citizen participation in linkage institutions, legislative action, and judicial oversight. Citizens will play an important role in the creation of this policy by engaging in grassroots campaigns, participating in public comment periods, and advocating through interest groups such as the Brennan Center for Justice, Common Cause, or the League of Women Voters, which have historically supported fair redistricting practices. These groups would mobilize citizens to attend town halls, contact legislators, and organize protests to demand changes to redistricting practices. Political parties may influence the discussion of either supporting or opposing the policy based on their electoral interests, while media coverage would help inform the public and shape public opinion by covering cases of gerrymandering and its effects on democracy. In the legislative process, citizens, through lobbying efforts or petition, would pressure elected officials to introduce bills that incorporate these boundary guidelines, ensuring that any redistricting process is fair, transparent, and nonpartisan. Once passed by state or federal legislators, the policy's execution require oversight from independent commissions and judicial review, with the citizens and media's role being to publicly monitor the execution of the policy and raise any legal challenges if necessary. Thus, citizens would be actively involved in advocating for, creating, passing, and executing the policy to ensure that redistricting is done fairly and in the public's best interest. Finally, a policy requiring an alternative method of representation, such as proportional representation or ranked choice voting, though radical, would significantly reform electoral systems to improve fairness and inclusivity. Proportional representation allocates legislative seats based on the percentage of votes each party receives, which ensures minority parties, such as third parties, gain representation proportionate to their support. A state with proportional representation could allocate its congressional seats to reflect statewide vote totals, which would reduce the impact of gerrymandering by eliminating single-member districts. Ranked choice voting allows voters to rank candidates in order of preference, with candidates being eliminated and votes redistributed until one achieves a majority. A policy requiring ranked choice voting in congressional elections would ensure that elected officials represent a majority of voters, which would help mitigate the partisan polarization created by gerrymandering by rewarding broad-based appeal and reduce the winner-takes-all incentive that motivates gerrymandering in the first place. However, the U.S. does not follow proportional representation, primarily due to its historical reliance on single-member districts, as well as the winner-takes-all incentives of the first-past-the-post system, and political party resistance, structural barriers in federal elections as well as voters' familiarity with the current system and state-level control over elections. To pass and enact a policy requiring an alternative method of representation, the process would begin at the federal level with the introduction of legislation in Congress. Lawmakers, particularly those in the House and Senate Judiciary or Elections Committees, would draft a bill, likely with input from electoral reform groups, political analysts, and academic experts. The bill would need to be carefully designed to address the concerns about shifting from single-member districts to multi-member districts in the case of proportional representation, or implementing ranked choice voting, which would also require changes to the electoral college system for presidential elections, potentially. Once the bill is introduced, it would be debated in both chambers of Congress, with opportunities for amendments and hearings to clarify the details of how the new system would work in practice. If the bill passes both the House and Senate, it would be sent to the President for signature into law. Once signed into law, the policy would require significant implementation at both the federal and state levels. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission and the Federal Election Commission would be responsible for establishing new federal guidelines, supporting state election boards with technical assistance, and overseeing compliance. At the state level, state legislators would need to pass additional laws to conform to the new federal requirements, including adjusting local and state level elections to incorporate proportional representation or ranked choice voting systems. This could also involve changes to how congressional districts are drawn or how candidates are placed on ballots. State election commissions would be tasked with overseeing the practical implementation of the new systems, including providing voter education and updating voter infrastructure. Given the complexity and significant change to the electoral system, the transition would likely span several election cycles. State-level courts would also address any legal challenges during implementation. Alright, so citizens can use interest groups, issue networks, and social and protest movements as tools to directly influence how alternative representation policies are arrived at by creating sustained pressure on political leaders and creating public awareness of the issue. The policy requiring an alternative method of representation would likely be arrived at through a process involving both grassroots and institutional actors. Citizens can play a role in this policy shift, initially through mobilization by nonpartisan or ideologically diverse interest groups focused on electoral reform, such as Fair Vote or the Brennan Center for Justice. These organizations can form alliances with issue networks comprising academics, civil rights groups, and reformist political consultants to advocate for reform. Over time, if public dissatisfaction with gerrymandering and partisan gridlock grows, social movements, perhaps led by younger, politically engaged voters, would increase the demand for fair representation, which can result in petitions specifically calling for proportional representation or ranked choice voting. Now, I'm definitely not saying that this would realistically happen, but I'm rather giving an example as to how citizens could influence the policymaking process. This is because, in practice, enacting such policies would face significant structural and political challenges, including resistance from major political parties and institutional inertia. Now, if this policy were to be nationally enacted, there are 4 models of proportional representation voting that citizens could engage in. First is open list, where voters select an individual candidate from a party slate. Seats are allocated proportionally based on party votes, and the candidates with the most votes within each party win. For example, in a 6-seat district, if Democrats would win 50% of the vote, the top 3 Democratic candidates are elected. Second is closed list, where voters choose a party rather than individual candidates. Seats are allocated proportionally, and candidates are seated in order predetermined by the party. For instance, if Republicans win a 50% in a 6-seat district, the top 3 candidates on the Republican list are elected. Third is mixed member systems. So here, voters make 2 choices, one for a single-member district representative and one for a proportional representation statewide. This system blends winner-take-all districts with proportional seats to balance proportional representation. For example, a party losing all 3 distinct seats in the state could still win 1 or 2 proportional seats based on statewide votes. And finally is ranked choice, which is where voters rank candidates by preference. Voters are reallocated to rounds of counting as candidates are elected or eliminated until all seats are filled as well. So for example, if a candidate exceeds the votes needed to win, surplus votes are transferred to voters' next preferences. Part 3, Civic Action. So how is gerrymandering, civic actions, and policy connected, and how does citizen action and policy interact? Well, in this case, gerrymandering, civic actions, and policy are connected through a cycle where citizens, often in response to perceived unfair districting, mobilize through legal challenges, advocacy, or protest to demand reform. These actions, such as filing lawsuits or pushing for new legislation, prompt policymakers to reconsider the impact of partisan or racial manipulation of district lines, potentially leading to new policies or judicial rulings that limit gerrymandering practices, such as the establishment of independent redistricting commissions or legal thresholds for creating fair districts. Through this process, citizen engagement drives the policy agenda, which impacts the political landscape by ensuring that policies reflect the democratic principles of equal representation. So Baker v. Carr was a landmark Supreme Court case that addressed the issue of legislative reapportionment in Tennessee. By 1962, Tennessee had not redrawn its legislative districts in over 60 years, despite significant population growth in urban areas compared to rural areas. This caused urban voters to have less representation, as rural districts had disproportionately more voting power. This case centered on the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, with plaintiffs arguing that the failure to reapportion violated the principle of one person, one vote, as urban residents were being denied equal protection under the law. The constitutional question here was whether the courts had the authority to intervene in redistricting, a traditionally political issue. The majority opinion written by Justice Brennan held that the issue was justiciable, meaning that courts could rule on it, and established that reapportionment cases were not political questions, but legal ones. And the minority argued that redistricting was a political issue best left to the legislative branch. The court ruled that the case was justiciable and required states to reapportion their representatives in a way that equally represented all the people so that no votes counted more than any other vote, which led to redistricting efforts across the country. This case is an example of how citizen actions through legal challenges can directly influence policy by prompting the courts to address issues of unequal representation, which led to the enforcement of the one person, one vote doctrine. Citizen action in the form of lawsuits from urban residents exposed the failures in legislative reapportionment, which ultimately helped create a more equitable system of redistricting. Alright, so Shaw v. Reno involved a challenge to the redrawing of North Carolina's congressional districts following the 1990 census. The state created two majority black districts, one of which was drawn in an unusually convoluted shape, which raised concerns of racial gerrymandering. The plaintiffs argued that this district violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment because it was drawn based solely on race, which they contended was unconstitutional under a colorblind interpretation of the Constitution. On the other hand, the state argued that the districts were created to remedy historical racial discrimination and to ensure that African Americans had fair representation in Congress. The court ruled in favor of Shaw, stating that the district's primary basis on race was unconstitutional because it violated the Equal Protection Clause by setting a dangerous precedent for race-based districting. The decision established that racial gerrymandering, even with noble intentions, could not justify the drawing of districts solely based on race, and that redistricting based on race must be, quote, held to a standard of strict scrutiny under the Equal Protection Clause, while bodies doing redistricting must be conscious of race to the extent that they must ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act. Now, this ruling was built off a previous case, Dornberg v. Gingles, which upheld the creation of majority-minority districts, ruling that if a minority group is large enough and geographically compact, redistricting should ensure that their voting power is not diluted. This decision supported the Voting Rights Act Section 2, which aimed to protect racial minorities' voting power by preventing districting practices that undermine their electoral influence. Dornberg v. Gingles specifically addressed North Carolina's redistricting, which had previously diluted black power, or black vote, by dividing communities into multiple districts. The court ruled that the state's redistricting violated Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act by minimizing the influence of black voters in certain districts. Both of these cases exemplify how citizen actions through legal challenges to redistricting practices can influence policy by pushing courts to interpret constitutional protections such as the Equal Protection Clause and the Voting Rights Act in the context of racial gerrymandering. In this way, both cases are examples of the interaction between citizen advocacy, represented by plaintiffs arguing against racial gerrymandering, and policy shift in the judicial system, which ultimately established a legal precedent, limiting the role of race in redistricting. Part 4, Reflections. So ultimately, I think the study of policy is really important because it allows us to understand processes through which laws, regulations, and reforms are developed, enacted, and enforced, which directly shapes the lives of citizens like us. By examining how policies are formed, contested, and implemented through the interactions between civic actions, legal challenges, legislative deliberations, and executive decisions at different levels and branches of government, we can gain insight into the mechanisms of governance, and the role of citizens in influencing government actions. This understanding is important for promoting informed civic engagement, as well as recognizing the impact of policies and creating a deeper understanding of how governmental decisions reflect and respond to social, economic, and political issues like gerrymandering. Analyzing gerrymandering, the government and civic responses to it, and exploring both historical and contemporary examples directly correlates with my knowledge, or with the knowledge of an effective citizen, by broadening and increasing the depth of my understanding of how electoral processes can be manipulated and how these manipulations can distort democratic representation. By examining how policies are passed and enacted to address them, I've also gained a greater insight into the importance of fair representation and the constitutional principles that guide redistricting. This knowledge allows me to critically assess how current policies affect contemporary politics, as well as the public's role in shaping those policies and how the legislative and judicial branches interact in regulating and responding to electoral fairness. Furthermore, this project has really increased my skills, I think, in critical thinking, as well as advocacy and public analysis and policy analysis. By studying the strategies used by political actors, activists, and policymakers in addressing gerrymandering, I developed the ability to assess policy proposals as well as understand their potential impact on democracy and participate in informed discussions on electoral reform. My actions as a citizen are directly impacted by this knowledge, whether it's through voting, participating in campaigns and interest groups, or advocating for reforms aimed at eliminating partisan or racial gerrymandering. Finally, this work impacts my attitude towards governance and civic responsibility by encouraging a commitment to fairness, equity, and active participation, and holding elected officials accountable, which has allowed me to understand that an effective citizen is one who is not only informed about policy, but is also proactive in supporting policies that promote justice and democratic integrity. Thank you. Please be sure to check my works cited in the description of this video. Hope you enjoyed.